When we're talking about school settings, we're talking about kiddos who may have more than one barrier. They may be neurodivergent, there may be behavioral issues, there could be trauma going on. Do you think that schools are prepared to deal with things in a trauma-informed response, or are we not hitting that?
We're definitely not hitting that. I think there is more talk about trauma-informed care in schools and neurodivergency, how that relates and is intertwined, but there aren't enough professionals, there aren't enough teachers to focus on that individually when they have other things that students are distracted by,
Sure.
Such as behaviors. They don't really have the time to sit there and try to learn on the go. And a lot of times that's what professionals do who aren't informed and who don't have that knowledge when it comes to trauma-informed care and neurodivergency. So there is talk coming about it, but as far as interventions and the help, the support that our students need, it's not there. And I can speak from my own experiences, even working in residential schools based off of neurodivergency and autism, where I had to learn on the go when it comes to trauma-informed care and how it impacts our neurodivergent populations. And it wasn't from professional developmental trainings. It was from other peers and coworkers who understood that
lived experience.
Who had children and what they had to go through just from their lived experiences. So it's needed because again, schools and teachers see what's on the surface, but don't understand what's going on underneath. And a lot of times that's the trauma and care modality of what's going on in the homes, what's going on in the communities, what's impacting these children so that when they come to school, they may need an outlet, and those behaviors, they just need to be seen and recognized. And it's amazing as an ADHDer, that is what I experience, the labels being bad, talk about disproportionate discipline, and I know as well being in schools that if somebody is suspended or, put out of school for a little bit of time just so that we can figure out a plan of what's next, teachers, we all feel like we are getting a break. It's like when that student who has caused behaviors in the class, when they're not there, when they're removed, feel like we're getting a break. And then when that student returns, then there's, hostility, or you just feel yourself just going down because that student now has returned. So not only does the classroom feel it and the teachers feel it, but also that student feels it.
Do you, and you may not, but do you have ways that you think we can combat that? Do you think more training on the trauma-based interventions would help, or do you think that teachers are so overloaded already that it's going to be, years down the line before we get to actually stop talking about it and having actions that back it up, that show, because the data's already out there, right?
It would be interesting to see how that curriculum is presented in the schools.
Okay.
How that could be talked about day to day, just in classrooms or different lectures, different classes. But they're overwhelmed, they're burnt out. So I can only imagine them feeling like they have to learn something else, just to be in a school setting when, again, there's a lack of substitutes, there's a lack of teachers, they don't have the help that they need, and then with the burnout of behaviors, it makes things worse. So I also just want to mention a couple of responses from the community with individuals that we know personally as friends, but also professionals when we talk about just disproportionate discipline and how minorities, marginalized children may be treated differently.
Absolutely, we'd love to hear that.
And just for namesake, I have abbreviation of names.
Sure.
So first statement says, I feel like when it comes to disciplinary action, society has been harder on minorities. Therefore, with them being harder on them, sometimes the expectations aren't realistic. I do feel that when discipline is given to our minority kids, they are not given the same opportunity all the time to correct themselves or do better. The punishments are harder, and with special needs children, it's hard for them to even understand what's even being asked of them. Unfortunately, I've had experience with both perspectives with my son having autism, where we've had the overzealous type of support, where he was coddled, unaccepted behaviors excused, would just do better next time. And then we also have had those where, because he has special needs, he doesn't get the same chances as other kids, or they overlook him thinking he can't do it. And in those circumstances, if I had his father and if we weren't present, and if we didn't call, and if we didn't see it, the approach would have never been changed. Sadly, many of our minority children face these challenges. In all, I definitely feel the discipline for our minority special needs youth is unfair. And that was from Tay.
Wow.
And then another friend of mine who has an autistic son, he states that I've seen sometimes things are approached differently depending on the school or the teachers. Some teachers really try to understand my son's needs, while others seem quicker to label behavior instead of looking deeper. I wouldn't say it's always the same across the board, but I do feel like minority kids can sometimes get less patience and more discipline, where other kids might get more support. That's just been my perspective as a parent, and that was from KT. And then our last statement is from a professional who works with autistic individuals in the community, and she states she knows that there's data that discusses our marginalized and minority youth being more likely to be diagnosed with things like opposite defiant disorder and neurodevelopmental disorders. And sometimes there aren't educational plans and more disciplinary action, like suspensions and school suspensions, detentions, and things like that, versus interventions for what they need.